Who? When? Where? How? And why? Understanding our past helps us see patterns that might otherwise be invisible in the present. Welcome to History Reports channel.
Long before the first pharaohs raised their enormous edifices along the Nile, signaling the emergence of the world's second great civilization, the river was a source of sustenance for small bands of hunter-gatherers. Fish and fowl abounded there, antelope frequented the shallows, and wild barley took root in the rich layer of silt deposited during the river annual flood. The prehistoric peoples of the Nile harvested this bounty with stone blades and arrowheads. And when the cresting river threatened to inundate their commons, they simply withdrew into the nearby desert, biding their time until water receded. This primitive hand-to-mouth existence prevailed along the Nile until around 5200 BC, or some 2,000 years after the inhabitants of Mesopotamia had begun to work the soil. But slowly over the succeeding century, a fresh influx of settlers versed in the rudiments of agriculture changed the face of the Nile River Valley. Some of these newcomers drifted in from the Fertile Crescent, the arc of arable land stretching from Mesopotamia to Palestine, bringing with them livestock and domestic strains of wheat and barley. In time, through migration and trade, a number of practices that had been fostered in Mesopotamia would find their way to Egypt, including the use of wheeled vehicles and elements of the Sumerian system of riding. Yet the most important link between the two cultures was the process of irrigation. Not long after the people of Sumer learned to raise dikes and dig canals, the inhabitants of the Nile Valley began to divert the river's floodwaters. As in Mesopotamia, that effort yielded two things crucial to the development of the civilization: an agricultural surplus and a spirit of collective discipline. The yearly flood that nurtured the crops of the Egyptians originated in equatorial Africa, where 4,132-mile-long Nile arose. Beginning in late spring, monsoon winds sweeping from the Indian Ocean dumped torrential rains on the highlands of East Africa, feeding the tributary known as the Blue Nile. The swollen branch roiled northward through mountain gorges, tracts in marshlands, and fetid jungles before merging with the White Nile near present-day Khartoum. Soon after the summer solstice reached, the flood surge reached the Nile Valley, a 500-mile-long cleft in the Sahara extending from the first cataract north to the marshlands of the Nile Delta. Fortunately for the settlers of this fertile corridor, known as Upper Egypt, natural mound-like levees had built up along the Nile as its heavier deposits accumulated over the centuries. Sheltered from all but most severe floods, villagers waited out the deluge in their mud huts atop these so-called tortoise backs, venturing abroad now and then in sturdy papyrus rafts to fish the muddy waters or to barter with neighboring village. Later, as the Nile receded, the floodwaters were trapped in the natural depressions that flanked the tortoise backs. Now the peasants labored together to plant grain and to exploit those reservoirs for their seedlings, hauling the water in buckets to nearby plots or channeling it along the narrow ditches. The urge to expand these irrigation projects up and down the banks of the Nile promoted communal links all along the river. In time, groups of rural settlements were organized into provinces, or nomes, governed by chieftains, called nomarchs. With few forbidding civic or geographic barriers to overcome, the nomes of Upper Egypt were soon consolidated. The process began around 3500 BC, and within a century or two a single ruler held dominion over the region. To the north, however, in the wetland of the delta, a different set of conditions prevailed. There, most settlements were isolated year-round on sandy mounds above the marsh. Until large portions of the swamp were reclaimed by the pharaohs, this region known as Lower Egypt was a land of more peril than productivity. Herders tended cattle in swampy pastures where crocodiles lay in wait for the stray calf, while hunters took to the meandering watercourses armed with spears against the hippopotamus, a volatile beast capable of crushing a man between its jaws. This way of life reinforced the age-old virtues of bravery and resourcefulness, yet did little to sharpen political instinct. Naturally enough, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was sparked not among the communities of the Delta but in the more cohesive Nile Valley. Just who was responsible for bringing the two regions together remains unresolved. Egyptian tradition tells of god-king named Menes, a figure whose celebrated feats may in fact represent the accomplishments of succession of ambitious overlords between 3200 and 3000 BC. Among them the shadowy kings identified as Narmer and Ehe on ancient carvings. In any event, Menes was memorialized as a leader of Upper Egypt who through military conquest and political machinations extended his dominion in Lower Egypt. To commemorate his triumph, it was said he built the white-walled capital of Memphis on land reclaimed from the Nile near the strategic point where the river branches out to form the delta. The proud new state consolidated by the mysterious Menes would grow to maturity in relative isolation. Bordered by desert expanses to the east and west, by cataracts to the south, and by a vast sea to the north, Egypt would suffer few hostile incursions in the centuries to come. And while Egyptian merchants pursued foreign trade and Egyptian soldiers made occasional forays across the borders, there was little need for campaigns of conquest. The river itself rendered ample tribute to the people. Unlike the erratic Euphrates and Sumer, the Nile rose and fell with regularity that encouraged agricultural planning and building projects while instilling in the culture a sense of harmony. As the river counted out the years and centuries in flawless cadence, that culture would produce a system of writing distinguished by graceful, natural symbols, a phalanx of fearsome gods and a temple-focused government, and an artistic, architectural, and engineering genius that expressed itself in astonishing monuments. The political consolidation of Egypt around 3000 BC marked the rise of the first dynasty of pharaohs. 29 such dynasties would follow, with shifts in lineage occasioned by the absence of heirs or by violent upheaval, before Egypt fell subject to the Greeks under Alexander. The word pharaoh simply means great house, and one of the missions of the first pharaohs was to establish their spiritual supremacy over all the other influential houses in the land. Since early times, the local chieftains of Egypt had laid claim to mystical powers. Each important village had its patron deity, and the noble who controlled the area took up residence near the temple of the god, where he could invoke his divine patron's blessing. Often the god was represented as an animal, a reflection of the awe with which the early Nile dwellers regarded the creatures that shared their fertile homeland. Thus, the ruler of Nakata in Upper Egypt derived his authority from the truculent god Seth, pictured as a fierce, long-snouted beast, and the chieftain of nearby Nekhen secured strength and cunning from the falcon god Horus. In time, myths associated with these local deities were combined to form a compelling legend that told of a bitter power struggle and celebrated the emergence of a god-king for all Egypt. According to one popular version of this legend, Horus was the son of Osiris, a god of nature whose power was manifest in the ebb and flood of the Nile. Osiris himself had once ruled Egypt, aided by his wife and sister, Isis, before he was brought down by his murderously jealous brother Seth, who dismembered Osiris and scattered his parts over the land. The faithful Isis went about collecting the pieces and patched them back together, thus resurrecting Osiris, who retired from his earthly responsibilities to become lord of the afterworld. Horus was left to contend with his uncle, Seth, for dominion over Egypt. Ultimately, the two met in epic combat. Although Horus lost an eye, he succeeded in castrating Seth. And in subsequent hearing, the earth god, Geb, declared Horus the victor and pronounced him king of Egypt. With the emergence of the pharaohs, the message of the legend was unmistakable. There would be a single ruler for Egypt, and he would be the incarnation on the greatest of Egypt's gods. Each pharaoh was the human form of Horus. Upon his death, he became one with Osiris and reigned supreme in the next life, while his heir ruled on earth as the new incarnation of the great falcon god. The tale of primal conflict and restitution not only provided a religious rationale for the power wielded by the pharaoh, but also helped fuel a royal obsession with death and mortuary rituals. A great imperative was defined by the reconstruction of the dismembered Osiris. The body of the god-king had to be preserved intact in order for him to attain immortality. The belief that fulfillment in the afterlife depended on the preservation of the body was shared by all Egyptians. To shield their remains throughout eternity, the pharaohs of the first dynasty built sturdy tombs in Upper Egypt at Abydos, a town that was destined to become the center of the Osiris cult. Abydos was nearly 300 miles south of the palace at Memphis, but a journey of such a distance could be accomplished on Egypt's Great River Highway. Already sizable boats made of reeds, with upswept prows and square linen sails, were plying the Nile alongside the rafts of peasants and peddlers. This kind of sailing vessel, propelled by the prevailing northerly wind that swept from the Mediterranean, may well have been used to ferry the pharaoh's body to its destination. The tomb that awaited the pharaoh at Abydos was a substantial structure known as mastaba. Meant to endure forever, it was built of sun-baked mud bricks, with a flat roof and sloping sides. Inside were compartments stocked with an array of offerings, food, furniture, tools, and weapons to fortify the dead king in the hereafter. Beneath the structure was a shaft that led to an underground chamber, hewn from rock and lined with brick. There, the pharaoh's body would rest. Surrounding the mastabas at Abydos were burial pits for the king's faithful retainers, including concubines, court dwarfs, and even pet dogs. All were expected to accompany the king into the afterworld. Indeed, there is some evidence that as many as 580 members of the court of King Jur, who ruled Egypt around 2900, were put to death so that they might carry on in his service. But the Egyptians were by no means a bloodthirsty people, and in time sacrifices ceased and burial near the pharaoh was reserved for the royal kinfolk and valued objects. The introduction of the mastaba gave impetus to the new craft at court, embalming. Separated from the drying sands by walls of brick, a court quickly decayed. The first measure taken in response to this problem was cosmetic. Swathing the body in linen bandages soaked in resin preserved the form of the body even as the flesh moldered within. This simple process yielded some impressive results. The linen-wrapped vestige of an arm, believed to be that of King Jur himself, was uncovered in plundered mastaba at Abydos nearly 5,000 years after the pharaoh had been interred. But the royal embalmers were not long content with preserving appearances. By the beginning of the 4th dynasty, around 2600 BC, they were taking the first step toward true mummification. They removed the dead pharaoh's internal organs through an incision in the abdomen and placed them in so-called canopic jar, a vessel filled with salty solution known as natron. The body cavity then dried and packed with resin-soaked linen before the exterior was prepared. Attentions that might include highlighting the face with green paint or decking out the shrouded corpse in jewelry and elegant robes. Not long after King Jur went to his grave with a legion of servants, the royal burial site was shifted from Abydos to Saqqara, much closer to Memphis. Over the years, the mastabas grew more imposing, up to 17 feet high, with as many as 70 chambers. With the reign of the 3rd dynasty's King Zoser, around 2650, the royal burial place underwent a radical transformation. By this time, the power of the pharaohs was absolute, and all Egyptians were subject to his dictates. In erecting his tomb, King Zoser also had the benefit of the services of a versatile genius named Imhotep. The tomb Imhotep designed for Zoser took the mastaba form to new heights. Assembling hundreds of thousands of limestone blocks, Imhotep in effect built 6 mastabas of diminishing size, one on the other. The result was a ziggurat-like tower known as the Step Pyramid, a name that suggests its spiritual function. Dominating the horizon at Saqqara, Zoser's monument rose 204 feet and measured 413 feet by 344 feet at its base. Many scientists have said that this was the first pyramid the Egyptians ever built. The Step Pyramid marked the beginning of the pyramid building era that led up to the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza. Lastly, one thing is certain. The more we learn about the pyramids, the more they continue to fascinate us.